Great Lakes Prepping here. This is basically a part 2 of a video that I started talking about how to prepare tomatoes for making and canning sauce and juice. And I really recommend, if you haven't already, watching that video first, where I describe really and show how to take all of your tomatoes and strain them, turn them into the sauce, and get them ready for canning. This video is all about the actual canning. It's going to be pretty straightforward because it's a pretty straightforward can. We're taking some sauce, we're taking some juice, we're putting it in mason jars, processing it in a hot water bath canner. I don't have as many tomatoes this year as I have in past years, and that was more or less by design. I was focusing on some other things, using some of my garden space for other vegetables, but we're still gonna get a good couple of jars out of this, and that's all it takes to show you how to do it. So we're gonna get started. We're gonna start basically with our juice and our sauce that we made earlier. As always, we're going to boil our jars for a few minutes just to make sure they're completely sterilized. And I've also got my lids over here in a little pan of water that I'm heating up. Now, I want to mention something about this. It was for the longest time considered a proper method to boil your lids before using them. In pretty recent times, maybe even in the last year or two, the Ball Corporation has stated that you don't necessarily have to boil them anymore. You can just heat them up in hot but not boiling water, and it'll be just fine. Now, I've read and seen videos where other people say that Ball has stated that this will damage the lids and make them not seal properly. But until very recently, I always boiled them until I sort of read this new information. And Ball has not stated that this will damage the lids. They've said simply that it is not exactly necessary to boil them, but it's still okay if you do. Me, I generally will now just sort of bring the water up to a boil and then turn it off. I'm not going to sit there and boil them for any extended amount of time. It's going to be just fine. So we're going to let these jars finish sterilizing and let those lids get in some hot water there, and then we're going to move on to filling these jars. Okay, we're going to very carefully empty the water out of these jars back into the pot and remove them from it, using our little lid grabber and tilting it very slowly so as not to splash any of that recently boiling water on myself. We're just going to tilt this out. There's certain things that should just simply not be rushed, and this is one of them. Just be careful. All the fresh sauce in the world is not worth third-degree burns. The next thing we have to talk about is acidification. Now, tomatoes are pretty acidic, but they're generally considered not quite acidic enough to be food safe in when processed in a hot water bath canner. Now, if you're pressure canning, a pressure canner can get temperatures much higher than boiling. Hot water bath canner can only get as hot as boiling. So we need to raise the acidity of this tomato just a little bit. And there's 2 common ways to do that. One is to add a little bit of citric acid. And this is the way I go because it doesn't really add any flavor in it, and you don't need a whole lot of it at all. In fact, I've had this bottle of citric acid for years worth of canning all sorts of things. So for quart jars, all we need is 1/2 teaspoon per jar, and just drop it there into the bottom of the jar. You don't have to do anything else with that. Just throw it in. Now, alternatively, you can use lemon juice, but you need more of it, and it can affect the flavor. If you don't mind that, go for it. But again, lemon juice, it's not that cheap. This little bottle, pretty cheap, and it's lasted me for years. Now, if you're doing pint jars, you would only need 1/4 teaspoon of the citric acid or 1 tablespoon of lemon juice. If you're going lemon juice, quart jars need 2 tablespoons. Next, we're going to fill the jars. Now, I kind of think I only have about 1 quart worth of of this tomato sauce. So we're gonna work with that. These jars are still quite hot, so be careful. I got my little canning funnel. And I'm just gonna fill. This is a pretty thick sauce, and that's what I like. Actually, if it was much thicker than this, I might think it's too thick, but I can always thin it out. Probably with some of my tomato juice. What we want to do is fill the jar and leave a 1/4 of an inch headspace. And I'm going to use my little scraper measuring tool. Basically, this first little stair step is our 1/4 of an inch measurement. And I can see that I need to bring this up just a little more. With other things that I'm canning, like pickles, I'm not as exact on this headspace. You know, I leave a little more than I probably need. But for this sauce, I'm going to make sure to get it right to where it's supposed to be. All right, now for our juice, same thing. You use this big measuring cup and just start filling them. I'm not worried about making a mess. That is part of this process. If you can do this whole tomato canning process without making a mess all over your counter and kitchen, well, then I'm not sure I trust you, because you're some kind of sorcerer. I am going to get just about exactly 2 quarts of juice, and that is awesome. No waste, no excess. That's just what I like. So again, we're going to get this right up to that 1/4 inch of headspace mark. Considering that some of these little bubbles will go down. Oh, there's 2 more things we have to do before we put the lids on. First, we take our little scraper tool and we're going to work this all the way around the inner walls of the jars. Don't have to do too much with the juice, it's pretty much liquid, but we want to dislodge any air bubbles that might be sort of trapped down in there. We don't want to seal this up with any unnecessary air bubbles. This gets a lot trickier when you're canning something like a jar full of vegetables, pickles, or peppers or something. You might have to more thunk the jar on the counter a bit because you can't really get this tool down in there. But for these, for liquid and mostly liquid things, you can do it pretty well. That is a thick sauce. That's going to make a really good marinara, which is what I'll probably use this jar for. All right, no visible bubbles. A couple little ones up here. Just kind of knock those loose. Last step before the lids. We need to take a damp paper towel and very thoroughly clean the top rim of each jar. You don't want any of this food residue getting trapped between the rubber seal of the lid and the edge of the jar. You're going to have a bad seal. You're going to have bacteria. You just want to keep doing that until you don't get anything left on that paper towel. I know this juice looks a little thinner than the tomato juice you would buy at a store in a can. Yeah, well, it's because the stuff you buy in a can isn't really juice. It's just shy of juice. They leave it a little thicker than juice. That's okay. When I use this in my chili, I just kind of adjust it. I don't add quite as much because I know it's going to make it a little more liquidy than if I was using canned juice. It's fine. It's worth it to have this beautiful jar of sort of pure, untainted tomato juice. All right, now to take my lids with the little magnetic lid lifter. Get it out of there. You can touch the top, you can touch the edge, just don't touch the bottom. Take that, put it nice and center on the jar. Now for the rings. Screw them on finger tight. Do not over tighten. That is it. These are ready for the canner. Look at that. Is that the prettiest jar of sauce you've ever seen? Juice is looking pretty good too. Okay. Over to the canner. Heat's back on. We'll put it in the jars. Two things to mention. One, this water is not cold. It's still pretty warm from when I was boiling the jars to sterilize it. That's good. It's going to take less time to get back up to boiling. Secondly, don't try to put the jars in boiling water. Yes, it will reduce the amount of time you have to wait for your canner to come back up to a boil, but I can tell you from experience, 1 out of, I'm going to estimate 6 jars is going to break. I've had the bottoms just snap right out, and now you've got a big pot of just broken glass and tomato soup that you've now wasted. One more thing. We want the water to be above the level of the jars, and it currently is. If it wasn't, I would have to put a little more water in. Now you can see this is pretty close to the top of the canner. So when this starts boiling, I want to keep an eye on it so it doesn't all start boiling over, making a huge mess. But I can see that it is just about a perfect inch above the lids of these jars, and that's what I want. So what now? Now we do what is considered processing the jars. Processing means cooking them at boiling for a predetermined amount of time. When we're talking about tomato sauce and tomato juice, these have to process for 40 minutes. Quart jars is 40 minutes, pint jars is 35 minutes. Now processing time does not begin until this is at a full rolling boil. So it's going to take a little bit to get this much water up to that. That's perfectly fine. I'm not going to worry about overcooking this sauce. It's just not a concern. Now, when we're talking about making pickles, the longer you cook pickles, the less crispy and crunchy that you risk them being. So it's more of a concern. It's a little more of a thing that you have to kind of navigate. But with tomato sauce, there's no making this any mushier than it already is. It's mush. It's sauce, it's puree. It's not going to hurt anything. You're not going to overcook it. So I'm going to put the lid on, let this get up to a full rolling boil, and then start my timer for 40 minutes. All right, here we are at a full rolling boil. So I'm going to start my timer for 40 minutes. We'll come back then. All right, 40 minutes is up. Processing is completed. And we're going to carefully take our jars out and put them on the counter. And there we have it. 2 jars of juice, 1 jar of sauce. We're going to let these sit here and cool pretty much all day. After a little while, I expect to hear the lids pop on each of them, probably within just a few minutes of one another. If, of course, any of the lids don't pop inward, I have to assume that the canning process failed and there is not a seal. If that happens, and it happens to everyone once in a while, that's okay. I can put the jar in the fridge and just sort of, use it in the next week or two and it'll be fine. But assuming that the seals were successful, these are shelf stable for quite a while. My rule of thumb for canned goods like this is about a year, although they never really last that long. So there you have it. A beautiful jar of homemade, home-canned tomato sauce and a couple of jars of homemade, home-canned tomato juice. There's lots of steps to process the tomatoes completely from scratch and end up with this as your final product. But it's really satisfying to do, and you just can't get a more delicious starting point for all of your favorite tomato sauce based recipes. In a subsequent video, I'm going to take this jar, or maybe one of the other jars I've previously canned, and turn it into a delicious marinara sauce. So be sure to subscribe and click that little notification icon so you can stay up to date on when that video comes out, as well as all of our other great videos. So that's it for now. Thank you for watching, and thank you all for your continued support. Until next time, this is Great Lakes Prepping.